When Jesus begins to speak to the crowds, nothing supernatural happens. No blind person regains their sight, no paralytic rises, no miracle confirms his words. Just a voice, dangerous ideas, and unseen promises. Without signs, the people must decide, follow by faith or turn their backs forever. What if the absence of miracles wasn't a detail, but the true test? Without healings, without signs, without visible proof, Jesus' message begins to divide more than unite. Religious leaders grow stronger, disciples waver, and the crowd demands something that never comes. But the more supernatural power is lacking, the more dangerous the message becomes. Because if nothing extraordinary happened, why were so many willing to lose everything? The final answer could completely change the meaning of faith, obedience, and Jesus' very purpose. When Jesus appears teaching in the villages, something is noticeable by its absence. No healing interrupts his discourse. No sign in the sky confirms his words. People listen, intrigued, yet restless. His teachings speak of love, renunciation, and an invisible kingdom, demanding inner change without offering external proof. Some draw near, touched by the depth of his words, while others turn away, frustrated by the lack of miracles. Without miracles to sustain faith, each listener must decide whether truth can exist without spectacle. This supernatural silence transforms each encounter into a personal choice, and the beginning of Jesus' journey comes to depend solely on the strength of his message, not on the visible power everyone expected to see. As the days go by, Jesus' reputation grows in a strange way. He is known not for impossible feats, but for words that disturb and confront. The crowds continue to come, but with frustrated expectations. The sick watch from a distance, waiting for something that never happens. Religious leaders feel relief and threat at the same time, for there are no signs to accuse him of blasphemy, only ideas difficult to refute. The disciples begin to silently question whether following someone without visible power makes sense. Yet something keeps them there. Without miracles to sustain belief, Jesus' message begins to separate true faith from curiosity, revealing who seeks transformation and who only wish to be impressed. As the message spreads, tension rises. Without miracles to silence criticism, every word of Jesus is rigorously examined. He speaks of forgiveness for enemies, of humility, of a kingdom that does not impose itself by force. For many, this sounds too weak. For others, dangerously profound. The authorities begin to observe closely, realizing that ideas can move crowds as much as signs. The disciples feel the weight of following someone who offers no visible guarantees, only conviction. Each step alongside Jesus demands more courage, for there is no proof to show, only a truth that needs to be lived. And in this scenario, the absence of miracles makes faith riskier, more personal, and impossible to inherit without conscious choice. Over time, the lack of miracles begins to take its toll. The crowds dwindle, the curious disappear, and only those willing to listen to the end remain. Jesus notices the change, but does not back down. His words become even more direct, more demanding, calling each person to individual responsibility. Without cures to offer, he exposes inner wounds, confronts pride, hypocrisy, and fear. Many feel offended and leave, unable to accept a truth that does not bring immediate relief. The disciples observe everything in silence, understanding that following Jesus now means losing status, security, and acceptance. The message continues to advance, not as a spectacle, but as a discreet flame that only reaches those who decide to approach. As Jesus' influence persists without visible signs, the religious authorities move from indifference to genuine concern. A man without miracles shouldn't have such an impact, but his words begin to change behaviors, question traditions, and weaken the control built up over generations. Unable to accuse him of supernatural feats, they try to discredit his origins, his authority, and his followers. Jesus continues teaching calmly, as if he knows that the absence of miracles makes his message even more dangerous. The disciples feel the net closing in, realizing that ideas can provoke persecution as intense as prodigies. At this point, following Jesus ceases to be an inspiration and becomes a real risk without any promise of visible protection. When tensions reach their breaking point, Jesus enters Jerusalem without fanfare, without expectation of miracles. There are no signs along the way, only suspicious glances and a heavy silence. His words echo through the courtyards and corridors like subtle accusations, exposing the fragility of a system sustained by appearances and fear. Without miracles to justify his immediate arrest, the authorities hesitate, but feel the urgency to act. The disciples perceive that something is approaching, even without understanding how it might all end. The absence of supernatural power does not impede the advance of the conflict. On the contrary, it makes each decision more human and each consequence harsher. Jerusalem does not expect a powerful savior, only a man whose words have already gone too far. If this interpretation is making you rethink this story, leave a comment below with your perspective. These videos are meant to provoke reflection, and I read all the comments. And if this type of content interests you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. On the night when everything begins to crumble, there are no signs in the sky nor visible omens. Jesus is led only by his words, not by extraordinary deeds. During the interrogations, the silence weighs more than any absent miracle. He tries not to prove anything, does not appeal to the supernatural, offers no escape. This disconcerts judges and followers. The disciples observe from a distance, realizing that they trusted someone who never promised power, only truth. Without miracles to reverse the course of events, Jesus' arrest reveals something unsettling. The message was strong enough to bring him there. And if words alone were capable of provoking fear, then perhaps the real danger was never the miracle, but what he taught. As the trial progresses, the absence of miracles makes everything more stark and definitive. There is no unexpected liberation, nor crowds clamoring for signs that never existed. Jesus remains steadfast, sustained only by the consistency of his words. To the people, he becomes just another man condemned for challenging invisible structures. For the disciples, the pain is twofold. Not only do they lose their master, but they face the possibility of having bet on something that never manifested itself supernaturally. Yet, something strange happens. Even without visible proof, Jesus' message remains alive, echoing in the minds of those who heard it. The cross approaches, not as a failure of power, but as the culmination of a truth that never needed miracles to exist. As the execution draws near, the silence becomes deafening. There is no divine intervention, no final sign to change destiny. Jesus walks knowing that everything depends on what has been said, not on what has been demonstrated. For many, this confirms the failure of someone who never proved to be more than an ordinary teacher. For others, it awakens a profound unease. If he didn't need miracles to transform lives, then his death doesn't erase his influence. The disciples watch from a distance, torn between fear and loyalty, realizing that the faith they chose to follow is not based on prodigies, but on convictions that will now be tested to the limit. The absence of miracles makes the final moment more human, more painful and impossible to ignore. After Jesus' death, nothing disrupts the natural course of events. There are no earthquakes, no signs in the temple, no collective astonishment. The body is removed simply, shrouded in silence and doubt. For the world, the story ends there, like so many others. For the disciples, the most difficult confrontation begins. Everything they believed must now survive without miracles, without the announced resurrection, without any visible proof that they were right. Some hide, others distance themselves, but no one forgets the words they heard. The absence of final signs transforms mourning into profound reflection. If the message was true, it will need to continue living only in the memory, choice, and courage of those who decided to listen. As the days pass, the void left by Jesus is not filled by apparitions or extraordinary accounts. The absence of final miracles forces each disciple to confront their own decision. Some return to their old lives, trying to silence what they have heard. Others remain together, not out of certainty, but out of responsibility. They realize that following Jesus was never about waiting for divine intervention, but about living what he taught, even without guarantees. The message begins to circulate in a low voice, not as a triumphant announcement, but as an ethical and spiritual challenge. Without signs to convince, Each word depends on who carries it. Faith ceases to be a spectacle and becomes a daily practice, risky and profoundly personal, sustained only by the inner truth that no one can erase. Over time, the story of Jesus without miracles begins to spread silently, almost clandestinely. There are no temples erected in his name, nor crowds seeking healing, only people transformed by a different way of life. The message about loving one's enemy, renouncing power, and choosing truth begins to disturb more than any prodigy. Authorities try to erase the impact, but realize that ideas do not die easily. Without signs to prove it, the faith born from this path demands constant maturity and courage. Each person who decides to follow Jesus' teachings knows that they will receive nothing in return but their own conscience. And precisely for this reason, this faith becomes more difficult to destroy. In the end, Jesus' legacy doesn't depend on miracles that never happened, but on choices that continue to be made. His life proves that truth can survive without signs, without visible proof, without immediate rewards. The world expected power, but received responsibility. It expected spectacle, but found awareness. The absence of miracles doesn't weaken his message, it only reveals who truly understood it. Jesus doesn't change history with supernatural acts, but with a proposition impossible to ignore: to live what one believes, even when nothing guarantees victory. And perhaps that is the greatest impact of all, because a faith that doesn't need miracles cannot be destroyed by doubts, only confronted by decisions. If you enjoyed this approach and want to continue exploring stories that are almost never told this way, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And now, click on the video that's appearing on the screen. It directly complements what you just watched and may completely change the way you see this story.